Hi, this is Adam Ballinger, and I'm here to start a topic that we've been covering in some workshops and some seminars. And it's a great topic for yoga, but it seems to get misused and slightly misunderstood at times. The topic is range of motion, and this is our ROM, range of motion or range of movement. When I ask trainees or people in seminars, what should we know about range of motion, or what are we trying to do with yoga about range of motion? A lot of times what I get is, in yoga we're trying to increase a person's range of motion, and that often sounds or looks like flexibility. So a lot of times we're talking about increasing our range of movement or range of motion. And we stretch, we do all sorts of stretches. We stretch everything sometimes. And I'm here to tell you that might not be the best thing to do. In range of motion concepts, there are body parts that move the best and the most healthy when they move a certain amount. So like a hip or a knee or parts of your back or your spine or your shoulders, if they don't move very much, it's indicative of an unhealthy movement pattern. And sometimes that might be indicative of an early situation of arthritis, or if the bones aren't moving very well, maybe their lack of movement will relate to a lack of circulation and even an accumulation of tissues in there, like a calcification. And then when things begin to rub, that's going to be something like arthritis. So not being able to move is not a very healthy thing, and that could be local or regional or systemic through the body. So a range of motion, it is important for us to be able to move. On the other side of that, if a body part moves too much, we can also have joint deterioration, joint damage, ligament damage. If your knees are very hypermobile and you slip or fall, or just even the way that you move, they rotate or they flop backwards too much in hyperextension, you'll probably end up wearing them out quicker. So too much range of motion can be a negative thing, and it can lead to lots of wear and tear on the body. It can even lead to different types of issues around the spine that could lead to nerve issues at some point. Too little range of motion also leads to circulatory and potentially even joint issues as well. So our range of motion work that we probably want to do in yoga is to bring balance to our movement patterns through how we move. If a range of motion is too high, the exercise and the work that we would want to focus on, if our range of motion movement is too high, then we want to increase stability. And we want to increase that stability in reference to where we're unstable or overly mobile. So overly mobile oftentimes equals unstable. If you see a person in a yoga pose and they come up and they balance on one leg and their knee bends backwards, sometimes we call this hyperextension. Extension just means that the knee has moved in the direction of extension. But the idea that it's hyper means that its movement was too much. Hyper, like hyperactive, too much activity. So hypermobility, hyperflexion, hyperextension is too much movement. So a knee that bends backwards, if you've seen an earlier video about knee stabilization work, on a knee that bends backwards or hyperextends, there might be some really good calf and hamstring work to bring stability to the knee so that the joint doesn't move backwards so far. The knee that hyperextends a lot can be at risk of different types of injuries, much more at risk than a knee that's not hypermobile in that direction. That could lead to ligament or meniscus, cartilage wear and tear, and eventually lead that joint structure to wear out. Yeah, so now if there's a part of the body where the range of motion isn't enough, let's take that same knee. If the range of movement in that knee, and we'll just talk about flexion and extension, if a person can't make the leg entirely straight, maybe they've had an injury or anything, but the knee, for some reason, it can't go all the way straight, and they decide to stand up. Or when they walk, the knee can't fully extend through that range of motion or range of movement. It's too low or hypo. then when that knee goes to lengthen and it can't, there's going to be an added stress on other parts of the body. If you had one leg that could lengthen all the way and another one that didn't lengthen all the way through the knee, your pelvis would tip, the vertebrae and the spine might even rotate, your shoulders would juxtaposition, then it would throw the entire body off. And making both knees not straighten in the same amount, or hypomobile, would still throw the body off, because that flexion and extension that's most optimal through the knee also relates to movements through the hips. So if both knees were constantly bent, you might see a person whose pelvis is a little bit more tucked under, and then the lumbar might be a little bit more flat. So too much range of motion or too little range of motion is going to throw a person off. If there's not enough range of motion, then we might want to increase mobility. The mobility is a lot of times going to be something that we can work on through stretching. And the stability is going to be muscle work. Yeah, that's the short and the quickest explanation of it. Yoga works fantastic. If you look at most active yoga poses, and so this is not necessarily somebody doing restorative work, laying on the ground and using props and pillows, but if we look at first warrior and second warrior and Ardha Chandrasana, Chaturanga, up dog, down dog, all of these poses, especially if we're doing them with active alignment, and when we're trying to create more balanced movements between different joints and articulations. Yoga poses are fantastic when we look at those, because if there is a place where we have too much range of motion, it shows up. You might have to practice on what to look for in a posture, but if a person is hypermobile in an area, like that knee, and we come up into a balancing one-legged pose, we're going to see that hyper range of motion, that too much range of motion, and it's really going to point out to us, hey, this is a place to increase stability. So our Yoga Asana might reveal some of this work. And if we have an idea of how to use the muscles and what to turn on, then that same pose that really showed us where we were hyper or too mobile becomes that fabulous pose where we can practice stabilizing movement. So the actual pose where we had an issue of being hypermobile can become one of the best places to practice the stability in there. And then likewise, if we were to come up and we came into that same balancing pose, Ardha Chandrasana, and my range of motion in my knee related to maybe my calf or my hamstring, I couldn't make the knee straight. Then maybe I use a yoga block or something else, but it's going to show up in that pose. It's going to be identified or exhibited in the way that my body moves. Yoga postures are built of movement patterns, and they show us a ton about the way that we move. There's no guarantee that when you do a yoga pose, it just fixes everything. In fact, a lot of times, if we're not doing something constructive in the pose, if we just come into a pose with the same movement habits that we came off the street with, then we'll probably do them in our yoga pose. That person who's hypermobile in the hamstrings, and they come into Ardha Chandrasana, which is the balancing pose, sometimes called half moon, and you take one hand to the floor. A person who's hypermobile in the back of the knee will probably continue to stretch the back of the knee more and more and make that habit even worse. But conscious practice and some reflection, that pose can become the best place to work on that particular issue. Likewise, the person whose knee doesn't extend all the way, maybe the hamstrings are really tight, we could have a number of different issues there. This pose could be a fabulous place to grab a yoga block and lift the back leg until the back muscles begin to strengthen, which can be part of a relationship to short, tight hamstrings. Sometimes they're related to long, weak, low back muscles, and we can begin to work on that slowly. People don't have to have straight legs, and they don't have to fit into these specific poses, but a lot of times our yoga postures really show us what our ranges of movement habits are. And they become great places for us to practice balance. And it's really not a perfection thing, it's more of like a tuning and awareness thing. So, our range of motion work when we're into our yoga poses should be more of a balancing thing. And if you're thinking that yoga is a great place to increase your range of motion, That's absolutely true. But you want to make sure that you're increasing range of motion in those places where it's going to serve you the most. Make sure you're not just increasing range of motion where your body will increase its range of motion without you doing much focus. A lot of times that can lead to long-term issues, movement issues. Those movement issues can turn into extra wear and tear on the body, and that's when we create long-term overuse issues, and those are basically like injuries. All right, there's our intro to range of motion, and what we can work on in yoga is to watch the body and see where it moves too much and where it's not moving enough, and see if we can bring balance to those different places. Stretch where we don't have enough range of motion for good human movement patterns, and strengthen in those places where we have too much. That's the balancing act. I guess the next question would be, how do we tell when we're moving too much and not enough? Well, that's going to take a little bit further study and a little bit more exercise in what to be aware of in your own practice. But I'll be happy to help you with that too. All right, this is Adam Ballinger, a nice little introduction to range of motion work on the yoga mat.